Let's take this very average photo and turn it into this using textures in Luminar Neo. Sometimes photos of our pets suddenly take on a greater importance or meaning to us. And I happen to have a snap, bit of a throwaway photo that I have of a friend's dog. It's not something that you're going to really want to put on the wall because, like I say, it was just a snap. So in this video, I want to edit that photo with a very creative approach and see if we can't create a more artistic version of that throwaway snap. Now, do let me know if you like this style of video because I'm going to freestyle this edit. I don't know how it's going to turn out. And if I make mistakes along the way, I'll be leaving them in the video and you can see my approach of how I may correct those along the way. Okay, let's get into it. So these are all photos from a recent trip to England, and as I flick through them, it's actually quite funny because I'm taking a heck of a lot more photos of animals than I ever thought I did. Horses, dogs, a lot of people. None of these photos that you see here have been pre-processed. There's nothing particularly amazing in terms of the photography, but these are my memories. It's really important, I think, that as we go through our lives, that we document what usually you think is the mundane, the everyday life, because you never know when the people that are in these photos aren't going to be there and aren't going to be part of your life anymore. So aside from the pet photography editing, I just wanted to make sure you guys are photographing people you love, people that are important to you. Now, going back to the portrait of the dog, this is the dog that we're going to be editing, and an absolutely lovely dog. And I quite like this shot of her. However, she's got the toy in her mouth, and I find that just a little bit off-putting. That's the same for this image here. Don't really want to use that one. If the toy wasn't there, I think that would be a lovely portrait to work with. But we're going to work with this one. This has got a few issues that I need to solve before we even get going creating a more artistic version. So to start with, I'm just going to run a quick develop raw on this. I'm not really concerned with the background here. My main focus is making sure we have a nice amount of contrast in the dog's face, and I particularly want to make the eyes pop. Just like with a portrait of a human, the eyes are the gateway to the soul. We really want to make sure that they capture the viewer's attention. And with that in mind, I'm just going to open up Enhance AI and smash on a whole heap of accent AI and then mask that in only over the eyes. And we can toggle our before and our after, and you can see that those eyes are just getting a little bit more intensity. Now, I don't know how visible this is on YouTube, but one of the issues I've got is that the focus is slightly off. It's on the nose here, and I was shooting this with a 1.4 lens, so those eyes have quickly gone out of focus. So what I'm going to do is see if we can't add a bit of that detail back in. So I'm going to increase the contrast in the small, medium, and large details. Have a quick toggle of before and after, and obviously that's far too much over the whole of the dog's face. So again, I'm just going to mask that in only over the eyes. So I'm going to choose a brush here and just paint that in over the eyes. And what I may do is actually just decrease the amount on the left eye here because that was actually more in focus than the other one. And so hopefully by putting 50% of that effect on the left eye, 100% on the right, we're sort of evening up that overall sharpness. Now, I just feel that the dog's eye, particularly on the right-hand side, is getting a little bit washed out through where the pupil is here. So I'm going to work with the curves tool to see if I can't increase that contrast. I'm going to pull down those shadows by putting points on the left-hand side of the curve and bring that down. And just to balance it out, I'll put a point on the right-hand side and boost that up. If I go to the before and after, you can see that this is a pretty extreme conversion. Certainly wouldn't want to be applying this through your whole image if we have a look at that. However, we can again use a mask just to put that only where we want it. So I'm just going to come in around the pupil itself, do a few clicks, and we can do the same on this side as well. It's subtle, but it's certainly helping to make those eyes pop. So if I move from our Tools tab into the Edits tab, this will show us what we've applied already. We've done an overall raw correction, which has got our overall photo looking pretty good globally, but then we just wanted to work on those eyes. So if we look at the before and the after, before and after, I think we're in a pretty good place to start our creative edit, but there is one thing that's bugging me, and that's just a little bit of dirt and dust and stuff over the dog's face. So let's see if we can't quickly clean that up too. So we'll need to jump back into the tools section, and there's a couple of ways we could do this. We could work with cloning out the anomalies, so we could just click somewhere we want to sample from, make the brush the size we want to paint over, and so on the ear we could just borrow from just above that little spot and paint it over. So here's our before and after. With cloning, it's all about borrowing from one area and painting that over another. And often you just want to make sure you're borrowing sections that share the same pattern and the same color. So for example, if I wanted to get rid of some of this dust around here, I wouldn't want to sample pixels from over here and then try and paint them over here because we're not matching with the tone. So I'll just press Ctrl Z to undo that. What you want to do is pick a similar tone to the area you want to clone out. And that's basically the only rule you really need to remember for cloning. So that's one way we could do this cleanup. Another option is to use Luminar's very good tools for this sort of thing, which would be the erase tool. And that just allows us to put little dots over things we want to get rid of. Anything that's particularly distracting, we can just mark it with the erase tool. And then when we click erase, Luminar Neo is going to do a great job of just cleaning those marks up for us. And now let's toggle our before and after, before and after. Okay, let's start getting a bit more creative. When you're working on any kind of edit, I always recommend have a game plan. Yes, it's fine just throwing sliders around and seeing what you can create, but you at least need to know roughly the direction you're heading in. And so with this particular image, there's a few things I want to do. One is I want to neutralize the background so that we really bring the attention towards the dog's face and less towards the distracting elements behind the dog. So that's one thing we want to do. I also feel like my in-camera framing was not the best. The muzzle of the dog is a little bit too close to the bottom of the frame and there's more space above the dog's head. So really I want to be able to shift that up. So that's something that we'll address as well. And the third thing that I find a little visually distracting with this is the color clash we've got going on. We've got a purple collar, a little bit of a green rug behind the dog, the orange in the dog's eyes. It's all a bit of a color clash. And the easiest way to solve a color clash is just to neutralize it. And we're going to work in black and white. Beyond that, the final thing I want to do is add that more creative artistic touch. And I'm going to do that with textures and add more sort of painterly and artistic strokes into this so that we can transform this more from a photographic look more into an artistic interpretation. Okay, so a lot to do. Let's get to it. If you blur your eyes and look at this photo, we've basically got a dichotomy between a black foreground and a white background. Now, normally I prefer things to be the other way around because your eye goes to the brightest part of the frame and I don't want the background to be the brightest part of the frame. If we just throw on a temporary blur effect over this, you'll see what I mean. The brightest part of the frame, it's easy to see the top background around the sides of the dog, and then the dog is the darker area. So let's just undo. Whoops, that's just jumped into the edit stack. I closed it rather than reset it. So we'll throw that away. Okay, there's various ways I could solve this, but I'm going to do this with layers. I'm going to duplicate this layer so we have an identical copy, one on top of the other. Now what I'm going to do is darken down the background layer and not be too concerned about how it affects the dog. I'm not going to see anything because the current layer on the top is showing through and I'm not changing that. So I'll hide that layer. Now I can see exactly what I'm doing on the layer below. So far I've just dropped that exposure down. I'm going to keep the shadows quite high and probably the blacks as well, because what I want to do is keep the exposure pretty much the same on the dog, just darken down what's going on around. So the whites, we certainly want to grab those and darken those down. The highlights, we can darken those down as well. And if we still don't feel like that's gone dark enough, what we can do is grab the furthest point on the curve, which represents the whites. And as you can see, I can just start pulling that down as well. And if we feel like that's starting to affect the dog too much, which exists in the shadows, we can bring that up so that we can keep his tone approximately the same. Okay, so currently that is our new background. I'm going to show our top layer, which was the original edit, so much brighter. And now what we will need to do is cut out the dog and show the background behind. So we can do that with layer properties and come into the masking section here. And I'm going to try portrait background. Let's give this a click and see how it goes. Okay, no portrait found. Why is that? Well, because this portrait tool is designed specifically for humans. So unfortunately for our canine friend, he has not been recognized. But let's try background removal AI. Let's see whether this technology does any better. And absolutely that's done a better job. You can see it's found the dog, but it's also added in just a little bit extra. Not a problem because we can combine masks. Now you'll notice that there's a bit of a halo around the dog's head, and that's not great, but I love the fact that we can just use AI to detect pretty much where the dog is, and then we can refine it from there. And that's what I want to do with a brush. So I'm just going to go around the edge here and try and create a better transition. I don't need to be super precise here because I'm going to jump back to that bottom layer and actually create a slight vignette coming out. So we'll have a brighter area around the dog's head, helping to draw our attention in. And that'll also minimize that transitional area between the outer edge of the dog and the background. So I'll come over to the layers palette here, and I'm just going to hide this top layer where we see the original dog edit. And now we just see the underlying darkening layer. So that is all controlled just with the develop tool that was darkening this background. And as I glance over to the right hand side, I'm thinking, where is it? Where is that tool? Well, it's because I don't have the correct layer selected. That's why I don't see it. I need to actually select the correct layer, which is my underlying layer. And now we see that develop tool, which is controlling that darkening effect. As I toggle the eyeball on and off, we can see exactly what that's doing. So what I would like to do is actually reduce the effect of that around the dog slightly. A radial gradient is an excellent option for this because it allows us to click in the center, drag out, and we have 100% of the effect in the middle, and it tapers from 100 to 0 at the outer circle. Now currently we would have the opposite of what we want. This would be revealing that darkening effect of the develop tool behind the dog, and then we'd get 0 of it at the edge of the frames. We want the opposite. So let's invert that and potentially just bring this in slightly closer. And now let's have a look at what this has done for us. Okay, you can see that it's brighter around the background of the dog. And as we show the cutout dog, you can see that that transitions a little better, but I'm not super happy with this background. So let's come in and work on that mask. So I'll just freestyle erasing and painting that effect where I want it. I can flip between the paint and erase mode just by pressing X on the keyboard. And one other thing we can do to help with the believability of this transition is jump to the layer with the dog and darken down around the edge. So I'm actually going to come in with a develop tool, jump into the masking section, and I'm actually going to clear that or invert that mask so it's got rid of, and that allows me to come in and just paint that effect only where I want it. So as I come around the top edge of the dog there, I'm just darkening down that particular part of the dog. If we look at before and after, you can see that that's darkened her down there. We can do that with the highlights at the bottom and even the collar that's sort of grabbing attention as well. Another thing we can do to help bring more attention to the portrait itself is to reduce contrast in the background. And we can do that just by lifting up these blacks slightly and then just using the curves to dial back the contrast. If we look at the before and after there, it's pretty subtle, but it just helps to drop this stuff further into the background. I mean, if we wanted to go further with that, obviously we have the blur tool inside Luminar Neo. We could use that to defocus the background further and just soften the effect of these sort of geometric shapes we've got going on behind the dog. So that's another option for us as well. And in fact, let's go with that. We'll just blur that up a little bit. Now, I just want to explain one thing. When you're working with layers, if we wanted to edit this photo as a whole now, we can't do that, frustratingly. Currently, whatever layer is selected, that is the one that a tool will apply to. And in some instances, that is brilliant. That's exactly what you want. And in others, it's a real frustration. So this is one of those cases. Let me show you what I mean. If I jump into the black and white, because I want to turn this photo black and white, and we just click convert to black and white, you can see it's only affected the top layer of the dog. So we would then have to come in to the underlying layer and do the same thing there. Black and white, convert to black and white. And at the moment, that is one of my biggest bugbears with Luminar Neo. And I've asked the developers to please look at creating a merge down layers feature. And they've assured me they're going to look at it. But when we see it, I'm not sure. But for now, there is a workaround. Let me show you how to do that. So the workaround is just to right click, come to export. And because we're continuing our editing, go for a nice 16-bit TIFF file, and the color space is probably best to be in Adobe RGB. sRGB is a smaller color space. Adobe RGB is much bigger. ProPhoto is huge. However, there's not a single monitor on the market that can display the full ProPhoto color gamut. So I like to work with Adobe RGB, which my monitor can handle quite nicely. So I'm just going to export that, and I have a temporary folder set up specifically for this purpose. And now I can jump into my catalog view and jump to my temporary folder. And there you go. We now have a flattened version of the dog portrait that we can carry on working on as a whole. So anything that I do, let's say I put some accent AI on this, you can see it affects the whole of the photo now. So the next thing I want to do is reframe the dog. As I said, I was not happy with my composition. So as you can see, I can pick up the layer when I'm in layer properties and move that around. So I'm literally going to shift this up to a point where I feel like it's a better composition. The fact that we can't see anything under here at the moment, I'm not worried about that. What we can do is come over and just add a new layer. Doesn't matter what it is. Choose to fill or stretch, doesn't matter. And I'm going to turn the opacity all the way to 100. Now I want to put that underneath. So I'm just dragging the layer underneath the dog portrait. And now what I'm going to do is actually turn this layer black and white. So jump into tools again, come to the essentials, black and white, convert to black and white. And now we just need to darken that down. I'm going to go whole hog and turn that pure black. Oh, that looks great, doesn't it? Okay, so we need to get rid of this break line between the two elements. And all we need to do is come up to the dog portrait again, and we can come into the masking of the layer itself. And let's just choose a nice linear gradient that we can taper off from the bottom and draw that up. So basically we're going to get full effect at the bottom, and it's going to just ease off as that plays up here. So I might actually bring this up a little bit higher. Of course, that's going to go over the dog. Now let's come out of it. Well, actually, let's not come out of it yet. Let's invert this so that we know that it's filtering from the top down. Now let's close that down, and there you go. We have a smooth transition taking us down into the black there. But if we feel like we're losing too much of the dog, what we can do is paint that in or erase that effect. Sorry, that is certainly not what we want to do. We do want to paint that in over the dog's nose. I told you I was going to leave all my mistakes in on this video. So there we go. We can see all of the muzzle of the dog, and we've got that tapering off. Now, because we've got that black in the background, anywhere else that we choose to just take away or paint the mask in, we're going to reveal that background. So let's go for erase again, and you can see that I'm starting to darken down that background. So we could actually paint in a faux vignette, so just darkening down those areas. Currently, I feel like the dog's muzzle is actually too bright, and that's drawing attention away from the eyes looking at us. So let's jump into develop and see what we can do about that. Easiest way to add contrast and darken things down, smart contrast. Okay, nice. What about the shadows? Should we draw that down? The exposure? Working with the sliders is such an easy thing to do, but personally, I still love the curves. Curves just allows us to fine tune exactly the look we're after. And I always like to toggle the before and after just to check that I'm happy with what I'm creating. And now I'm happy with that look, I can just paint that in where I want it. So I'm in the paint mode with a low strength, so I can just sort of build that effect up. So anywhere where I feel like it's just a little bit too bright at the moment, I can just paint that in. Okay, as I toggle the before and after, you can see it's pretty subtle, but I do feel like that helps. The common wisdom for YouTube videos is to keep them really short so that people will watch them. However, little subtleties of editing like this, I think it's really important to share that with you guys. But would you prefer a more condensed video and I leave that kind of edit, that part of it out? Or would you like me to make sure I cover all the details so that you've got that full knowledge right up there? Okay, let me know in the comments, but now it's time to start adding our textures to create a more artistic look. 100% you could leave the edit there and go for a more photographic image. good on you. But for me, I've got carried away with adding textures. I love it. I'm really into that at the moment. I know a lot of you have picked up my texture bundle on discount recently, so thank you for that. If you don't have it yet, I will link to it in the description below. But the reason that I really want to use that for this particular edit is I have a lot of painterly strokes, traditional media, and that is what's going to take this from a photo to a more artistic look. So if you want to check that out, link in the description below. If you want to follow along with your own textures, that is fine as well. The principles are going to be the same. Okay, let's throw some textures at this and see what we can create. So the process of adding textures is easy. We come over to the layers section, click the plus icon, and then just find the texture that you want to use. In the painterly texture bundle, I've got a whole heap of paint strokes. We can honestly throw anything we want onto here, and I think it's going to work well. So let's go for this one. Click open, then double click it, and it will be loaded as a layer. I'm not quite sure why it loaded it up that way, but no problem. We can just turn it round and we can scale that up. So let's just throw that over the top. And currently we have a 50-50 blend. But the magic of textures all happens with the blend modes. So as I move my mouse over these different blend modes, you can see that the texture interacts with the underlying photo in a different way. So I covered all that in the previous video, so I won't go into too much depth, but overlay, that's a really nice option. We can go for 100%, and straight away, this has got a very artistic look to it. Might not be exactly what we're after, but that's fine. We can fine tune this. Personally, I don't like to go all in on one texture at a strong opacity like this. I like to just drop it down relatively low and just build the effects up slowly. So just throw more and more textures over the top of each other, and it just really helps to create that visual feast that I've referenced before. So we double click the texture. There we go. We've got another brand new texture over the top. And let's see what we can do with this one. If you're not sure which blend modes to use, I'd say focus on multiply, screen, which lightens, and then overlay, soft light, and hard light are all really nice blend modes that focus on contrast between the layer you're introducing and the layer that's underneath. I really like soft light because it's a more subtle introduction of the texture. And again, I'm going to bring the amount down, I don't know, 38. Let's go for that. Okay, let's go for another one. What else have we got? I'm going to jump out of the painterly textures actually and see what else we could add. Let's go into the artisan textures. And for this one, not only am I going to focus on the texture itself, but also the color that it's going to introduce. So we double click that texture. It's dropped over the top. And if I push the opacity to 100 in normal mode, we see exactly what that texture looks like. Okay. Now I'm going to come down, and if I go into hard light, that's certainly going to introduce a lot of that color. And I'll grab the opacity slider and just start bringing that back down. I quite like this texture, and I also like the uniformity of the color. Not necessarily the color itself, but the fact that the color is pretty consistent across the frame. Because now what that's going to allow me to do is jump into the color tool. And if you remember, whatever tool we apply only affects the layer that we're talking to, the layer that's selected at the moment. So if I was to desaturate that particular layer, we take all the color away. If I increase the saturation, it boosts the saturation of that particular layer. Perhaps if I change this to normal mode, just temporarily, you're going to see exactly what I mean. So we've got 70% of this layer being shown at the moment. We've applied a color tool with 100% saturation. And as I desaturate it, it's desaturating that layer itself. But the key thing I want to show you here is how we can actually change the color. So we have the HSL tab, which is often hidden. We click it to open it up. That's hue, saturation, and luminance. Hue shift down at the bottom here is actually effectively color shift. Hue, color, same thing. But basically by grabbing that hue slider, we can actually change the color. And so whichever color we feel is more appropriate, we can just put that slider in that position. Let's say we want to go with this. I can boost the saturation slightly, maybe a little more orangey. And now when I jump back to our layer properties and change this from normal to overlay or soft or hard light, it's going to be introducing that color that we just created. So that's without the layer, and as you can see, the highlights are pretty much white, but as I introduce that layer, we get that orangey effect all through the photo. I don't need to go to 100%, but let's leave it pretty strong. somewhere around 58. In my last video, which was a really comprehensive demonstration of how to apply textures to photos, I used Luminar Neo, there was one thing I didn't cover, and I got asked a lot. Can you add textures and then mask that texture? Well, absolutely, because textures are added as a layer. We can mask layers, so therefore we can mask textures only where we want them. So let me just finish this demonstration just by showing you how easy it is to do that as well, and then we'll call this a wrap. So let's say down at the bottom here where we added that black layer originally, we haven't really got too much interest going on, and we want to add some texture down to the bottom there. Well, let's do that. Doesn't really matter what texture we load. Let's go for this one. I did say before, double click the layer. You only need to click it, not double click it. Okay, we'll crank the opacity to 100% so you can easily see what I'm doing. Masking, we have access to all of our masks. If I go to brush and in the paint mode, what I can do is start just painting this effect in. So as I put a stroke along the bottom there, it brought that texture into that area. And you can see that everywhere that I paint, now it just brings that texture in. So if we come back to the layer properties and drop the effect down to 0, it's gone, bring it in, you can see that it's only affecting where I painted around the edges. That's far too much. Let's drop the amount down. So with that same idea, if you felt like some of the texture was going over the dog and you didn't want it there, you could come into that particular layer and just use the mask to erase it. But to be honest, I don't mind if those textures kind of bleed over our subject as long as it's not really distracting. You would certainly notice it more over human skin and would need to take that off of a human. But because of all the hairs on the dog, all that detail, I don't think the texture really interferes with the overall look of the dog's face. As a final step, I just desaturated the photo and added my favorite mystical filter in Luminar Neo. So with the addition of textures, we went from this very bland, mediocre snapshot to more of an art piece that ultimately the dog owner may want to put up on their wall. Adding textures to our photos is a really great way to transform them into something more than what they originally were. If you want to check out my texture bundle, I've currently got 80% off, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. Also, if you have any questions about this edit or anything else, just leave them in the comments and I will get back to you. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye for now.